The Microsoft versus the US Antitrust case was a very important case to the industry. Microsoft, one of the biggest tech companies in the computer industry, was under investigation by the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, for violating antitrust laws along with IBM. Microsoft had made competing software that was pre-installed on their newest Windows OS, which created conflict with other smaller companies who made browsers for the OS that felt like this was unfair competition. Companies like Netscape were very unhappy with Microsoft's behavior, so the FTC took action. The case led to a compromise, with Microsoft being able to remain as one company while now having to share software with other companies to keep them competitive. This was one of the largest antitrust cases ever, and it was full of fire and passion, and it likely created the industry we know and love today, with many companies creating tech and not just Microsoft. In this documentary, we will tell you all you need to know about the largest antitrust case of all time. Antitrust was not anything new to the tech industry when Microsoft was accused of violating the antitrust laws. Many tech companies before Microsoft, such as AT&T, were sued for unfair competition. AT&T had used monopoly funds from its subsidiary company, Western Electric, to reduce the cost of its network. The ruling caused a breakup of the company, separating the Bell companies and leaving the much smaller telecommunications company. That was just one big example, but for many other tech industry antitrust cases, the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice knew how to handle antitrust with these tech giants. The original purpose of the antitrust laws were very simple: to protect consumers by promoting competition in the workplace. It worked to make sure that one company never had full control over its industry and to ensure that a possible monopoly was returned to a smaller state to compete with the rest of companies producing what it produces. Microsoft was not even close to being the very first antitrust case. Antitrust had been around since the 1880s. One of the first focused cases from antitrust was against the Standard Oil Company. In 1911, after a heavily debated court case on how to end Standard Oil's massive monopoly over the oil industry, it was ordered that Standard Oil would break up into 34 independent companies. The two largest are known today as Exxon and Mobil. The first major case against Microsoft began in August of 1993 when the Justice Department took over after the Federal Trade Commission only got 2 case deadlocks from their efforts against Microsoft, even though they were not declared an official monopoly until Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson declared it so on Friday, November 5th, 1999. During this time, Microsoft had control of over 90% of the market. That figure definitely made Microsoft a monopoly. Even with its massive control of its market, it took around 9 years from the time the first probe was sent in to the time Microsoft was labeled a monopoly. The main problem, aside from running almost all of the computer software market the FTC had with Microsoft, was the fact that they marketed their browser system with their computer. At the time, this was viewed as anti-competitive by the companies that could not afford to use this tactic. This was one of the things that was put to rest as a result of the court case. Microsoft, being the big company that it was, made a large effort to defend itself against the allegations. Some officials suggested that other companies were simply jealous of their success. These claims were swept away from relevance, however, when threats from Microsoft were leaked. These exposed their bullying tactics and showed that Microsoft was likely partaking in anti-competitive practices. Any information that got out about Microsoft's feelings of the accusations all showed employees of Microsoft pointing fingers back at Netscape, when in reality, Netscape had done nothing wrong in terms of the antitrust laws. It was Microsoft being accused for their anti-competitive practices, not Netscape. Microsoft's profits were reaching all-time highs before the court case, but took a sharp drop afterwards. It wouldn't be until late October of 2016 for their profits to get back to their levels they were in the late 1990s. Even with their profits back up to speed, Microsoft was not a monopoly again because of a much more competitive computer market. The very beginnings of the court case began in June of 1990 when the FTC sent a probe into Microsoft to investigate a possible monopoly. The probe didn't cause anything major and a second was set in. Both court cases resulted in a deadlock in which Microsoft faced no punishment. In 1993, however, the Justice Department took over from the FTC and a suit was filed by the head Anne Brigman. The suit was settled in 1995 without much of a fuss. Microsoft was not the only company to be investigated by the FTC and Justice Department. IBM was also being investigated for a possible monopoly in its market. IBM, however, settled its case quickly and quietly instead of resisting like Microsoft. This led to the case being much smaller, quieter, and less recognized. When Joel Klein became the chairman of the FTC, he began the second case. This case wasn't as long as the first, mostly because the information that they already knew came from the first case. This meant the majority of the FTC's time could be spent in court with Microsoft. Microsoft eventually had to go to court to defend itself against the allegations. This was the case known as Microsoft versus the US. For most of the case, the court wanted Microsoft to split into two smaller companies that were not allowed to do any business activities with or for each other. But after almost 5 years of debating and with several different put-downs and revivals, it was decided that Microsoft would stay together with some new rules. The main catch of Microsoft remaining together was the requirement of Microsoft making its software available on third-party computers. This meant that you wouldn't have to buy a Microsoft computer to get the best browser of the time. The second catch was that a board of 3 people would have to monitor Microsoft to ensure that Microsoft had completely stopped its monopolistic practices and did not pick them back up behind the government's back after the largest court case of the time. These people were to be elected by the government especially for the role of monitoring Microsoft. Before Microsoft was forced to share development, many companies were upset with how Microsoft was locking tools away from the developers. It was very difficult for these development companies, especially ones like Netscape, a small startup company that just took off with its recent success. They were developing a browser to compete in the early years of the browser wars. It was already very difficult, but Microsoft made it even worse when they released Windows Explorer, Microsoft's own browser for Windows. Explorer came pre-installed with certain copies of Windows 98. Jim Clark, one of Netscape's founders, felt like Microsoft thought of smaller companies like smaller fish, that they could easily bring them down or ignore them entirely. These unfair business practices that Microsoft was doing against small companies like Netscape were what attracted the attention of the FTC and Department of Justice. This court case prevented many things. For the most part, it prevented a computer market completely run by only one dominating company. It opened the door for the largely diverse industry that we would not have had if Microsoft had continued its upward climb in software and hardware. If Microsoft remained untouched, today we would not have companies like Sony, Apple, Dell, Google, and more. Microsoft is a big company today, but one probe ended up toppling a monopoly. Special thanks to Scott Hunter, attorney at law, and thanks for watching.